Hi, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Clerk, will you go ahead and call the roll?
Bajent,
Here.
Clegg,
Here.
Halliburton,
Here.
Sanchez,
Here.
Willetts,
Here.
Weddings,
Here.
all present.
Great. Welcome, everybody. We'll jump right into it. Councilmember Sanchez.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So today, I'm very grateful to all of you for agreeing to listen to this next piece of legislation that I hope we will be able to provide for our renters before the year is done. As we all know, renters are under tremendous stress as rents increase and there are few housing options. And although a majority of landlords, I would say, and property owners are people with integrity, we do have those folks in our community who do prey upon our renters. And some unscrupulous owners and managers try to make the matters worse by charging excessive fees for many things, including, as we know, application fees, and in this case, late fees. And for those of us who've served on council the last few years, you know, we have heard people, property owners, come before us when they argue against new projects that would be geared towards renters. And so we've heard our renters be denigrated. We've heard folks who rent cast in a negative light. And the fact is that renters are people too. They need to be treated fairly. An example of other rentals that are given a bit more dignity and grace than people who rent are storage units. This is something I'm really grateful to our staff as they did research on this issue to find out what rates are currently regulated in terms of late fees. And it turns out that storage units can only charge $20 or 20% of the rental amount, whichever is greater. And I provided you a copy of the Idaho Code 55-2304 that outlines that. Another group of folks who are given a bit more grace than our renters are homeowner borrowers who can only be charged 5% of the payment amount or $15, whichever is greater. And again, I refer you to Idaho Code 28-42-301. And these late fees can be collected only once. As it stands now, renters are left out. They are made to feel as if, like I said, as if they don't matter. And the reality is that we have more and more people who live in Boise, Idaho, who are renters. Most of our neighboring states regulate rental late fees. And I believe we provided a list for folks. And so, again, I do appreciate staff's efforts to research this to determine where Boise, Idaho falls in this type of support for our renters. So what you have before you is a proposal for a city ordinance to promote renter fairness. After discussion with our staff, I am supportive of an ordinance that would restrict rental late fees to a one-time 5% of the amount due or $50, whichever is greater. At this point, nothing has been done at the state level for 20 years to fix this. I believe state law only says that late fees should be reasonable. What folks determine is reasonable really is all over the board. I myself got a little taste of that last year when, after nearly 10 years of living at the same place, somehow I transposed the address of my landlady and my rent check was late. She's kind enough to offer a 5-day grace period, but on that 6th day, she let me know, like, I haven't got your rent check, so I need your rent and a $90 late fee. Thank goodness I was able to prove that I did set my rent check. I just put the wrong address down and she waived that late fee, but it gave me an indication of how all over the board these late fees are. I would imagine there's probably some landlords who may not even provide that grace period. In fact, I did get an email from somebody who said that they're a small landlord and they don't offer that grace period. So there's really no rhyme or reason to what we consider to be reasonable. So this legislation is needed to offer some support to our renters just to balance things out. So doing nothing is not an answer, especially in this environment where we all know that housing is at a premium. Housing is at a premium for buyers. much less renters. It's a volatile environment. As I sit up here today, I myself am getting ready to move to a new home. And I'm fortunate that I know somebody in the community who is offering me housing, but that's not everybody's situation. And so any bit of support that we can offer to our renters, I think is welcome. And the truth is, I've been thinking about this legislation for about a year. It's taken several months for us to get this far, and I'm really grateful to all of you for being open to hearing this discussion. So I urge you to support this action to make our rental system more fair in the city of Boise.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you, Councilmember Sanchez. So I think I have a few questions. And the first one is going to be, I know that there are some stakeholder groups out there who are developing legislative agendas and different things around rental and renter protections. Have you worked with any of those groups at all on what might be a city issue versus this, which I still kind of believe is more of a state issue?
Madam Mayor, Council Pro Tem Whittings, I have chatted with folks. The way it stands now, I refer back to our rental application fee ordinance that we passed in 2019. It's been 3 years, and as far as I know, no other municipality has replicated that piece of legislation. I take that as an indication that perhaps maybe it's not needed in other parts of Idaho. Maybe it's needed very specifically in our city because we are the capital city and we are large. I would say, again, referring back to my original statements, nothing has been done regarding this legislation in the past 20 years. And ultimately, our commitment is to the people who live in Boise.
Yeah, I think I bring that up because it's my understanding that there is a local organization where this is the Idaho Asset Building Network, where this is on their legislative agenda for this year, for this upcoming session, and where these other regulations are also in state statute. I think that the state has some different enforcement mechanisms that the city does not have as far as financial transactions. And so I think that that's kind of what gives me pause, is that we have perhaps the first state effort to offer these rental protections that we've seen, a concerted effort by a diverse stakeholder group, combined with, I think, the place for this being the state, ideally, and perhaps giving that a chance to go through the state before we did something city level. And so I think that's kind of my initial reaction to it, but I'll give others a chance to ask questions before I have anything further.
Madam Mayor? Well, first, do you want like nitty gritty or high level or both? Because I have a little short list here. But tell me what you think.
I'll take it all, Councilman.
Okay, let's start with a high level. Something that I was curious about in the draft or proposed ordinance is a reference in the statement of purpose to this notion that it's in the public interest to regulate these late fees during the time when there are few housing choices. And so the first high level question is, do you intend this to expire or sunset if housing choices become more available, or do you intend this to be permanent?
Madam Mayor, Council Member, at this point, if you feel that that's not welcome, that would hurt the ordinance, I'm 100% okay with removing that. I think it's just to highlight the situation that we're in right now and the urgency. One thing I would point out in doing the research and realizing that we do regulate late fees, for example, in the storage units and for home buyers. I think about myself when I was a homeowner. I had 2 years to come up with the $5,000 to bring myself up to where I needed to be to hold on to my home. Renters don't get that level of accommodation. And so just the urgency that we have as renters, I think warrants this type of legislation.
No, that makes perfect sense. And the reason I asked is just, it seems like part of the purpose is to protect vulnerable people from being price gouged through the form of, Byzantine fees. And that's actually kind of independent of how tight the housing market is. And so I wouldn't want to create a defense for a landlord or a property manager who charged outrageous fees. The defense being, well, this legislation says it's while housing is tight, housing's no longer tight in Boise. So tenants can act at arm's length and I can charge whatever I want. So that's why I wanted to flag that. In my mind, protecting vulnerable consumers is always a value, regardless of how tight the housing market is. And it shouldn't be a defense or a way to wiggle out of this. So that was piece of feedback number one. If it was me starting with a blank sheet of paper, I would say, hey, we want to protect vulnerable people from poor practices forever. So that was just kind of feedback number one. Second, my initial reaction to the percentages, I think that makes a lot more sense than what was in the draft originally, which was, actual costs incurred. And the reason that I like that better is it makes every, actual cost incurred makes every enforcement action a time-consuming kind of fact inquiry, whereas percentage of the rent is a nice, clear, bright line rule that's easy to administer. And in my mind, somewhere between 5 and 10% is probably the right number. I just did some rough math on average rents, and that seems to make sense. I have some concerns, I think, with the remedy section. The penalty for violating this is, number one, you don't get any late fee. And I think we all recognize that late fees do serve a purpose. That, some reasonable late fee is reasonable. And then number two, you get a $150 to $250 fine. And in my mind, the more reasonable rule would be, if you violate this provision, the late fee gets adjusted down to what is reasonable. And if you're a repeat offender, perhaps you get fined. And then the third piece of feedback is, my perception is that oftentimes the few bad actors who are engaging in this practice aren't necessarily property owners, they're property management companies. And property owners sometimes don't even know what the management company is doing with late fees. And so I would suggest that any late fee that is, going to be imposed be disclosed in the lease, so that the tenant sees it, the property owner sees it, it's written down on paper, and it can't be slipped in the back door. But that's my feedback.
Thank you. Great feedback.
And Mary,
Mhm.
so one question. I appreciate you on a regular basis defending the rights of renters. I sit next to you at council meetings, and I hear things that are insulting to renters, and it hurts to know that there's folks who feel that, and I can feel you feeling that next to you. So I appreciate your work here. I'm curious, Council Pro Tem Woodings brought up that maybe wanting to see this as a state issue. Do we have any other examples of other cities taking this issue on as a municipality rather than a state?
Madam Mayor, Council Member Halliburton, are you referring to within our state? Any other municipality within our state doing this?
No, not necessarily. Well, yeah, yes, our state, and then yes, other cities and other states. Do we see examples of this being owned by municipalities across the country, or is it typically always under the state?
From the research that we've looked at, I don't know that there's any other municipality in our state that has undertaken this. We've looked at other states. I'm not sure if we looked at specific municipalities within those states. But again, I would refer back to our rental application fee ordinance from 2019. What we have seen from the legislature is basically a lessening of rights, proposals that would have overruled our 2019 ordinance. So it's very difficult for me to see that there is going to be robust support for increased renters' rights at the state level. And ultimately, our charge is to support the people who live within our city limits. And any municipality who wants to replicate the rental application fee ordinance has had 3 years to do that. Why other municipalities have not taken our lead, I don't know. But this is where we are.
Thank you. And Madam Mayor, the second question I had it's very clear to me that there should be a fair amount or reasonable amount that people are charged, and that it's not all over the spectrum. And it seems like that would be easier for landlords as well as easier for the tenants. There would be a template to follow. Do you know currently, is it all over the place? Like, have you seen ones that are at 20%, or is there a range that you're seeing?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, at this point, because there is no guidance, the information that we've received is all over the place. There are those landlords who do offer a 5-day grace period or a few days, so that, you know, if you don't get your check into them on the 1st, you've got a few days. And then there are landlords who don't offer any grace period. For folks who live in a state like Idaho, where our wages are not exactly competitive, you know, we've got folks who are trying to piece together different types of income to come up with their rent. And so to have something in place for them that gives them a little bit of wiggle room in terms of like, okay, if they can't work something out with a landlord, that they might have a rent check that's not going to be on time that month. If they know like, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to get the rent in by the 5th or the 1st, depending on what that last day is. All right, I got to come up with another $50 to pay that late fee. But if they don't know, and right now there is nothing, there is no guidance other than the term reasonable. It really is up to the landlord, the property manager, to determine what reasonable is. And like I shared my own personal experience, $90 was a little bit of a shock to me. Luckily, my landlady offered grace and did not charge me that $90, but that's a real hardship for some folks.
Madam Mayor. Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Sanchez, for bringing this forward. I appreciate your commitment to making sure that vulnerable folks have some protection. So thank you for that. Having said that, I do have some questions. You've said that nothing has happened in 20 years to regulate rental late fees. Are you aware of actual legislation that was brought forward to hearing that was turned down by the legislature, or aware of other efforts to do this, or is there just been no action, in part perhaps because it hasn't been an issue?
Madam Mayor, Council President Clegg, it's my understanding that there have been recent attempts, but unfortunately they've not been fruitful. And in fact, again, I'll refer back to our rental application fee ordinance. You know, I've had to, at least on 2 different occasions, advocate for the legislation that was proposed that would have erased our rental application fee ordinance that we passed 3 years ago, to save it and keep it in place. And thank goodness we have managed to preserve it. I would say that is an indication of the appetite that the Idaho legislature has for protecting the rights of renters.
Thank you. I do know that there's a more recent coalition that's been built over the last year, specifically around the rights of renters, and that they're prepared to bring a bill this year. Have you talked to them or worked with them at all on this?
Madam Mayor, Council President Clegg, the folks that I have talked to related to this issue have been Senator Ali Rabi, Representative John Gannon, Intermountain Fair Housing Council, and actually a student group at Boise State that is working on dual credit with the School of Public Service. To me, that indicates that there is great concern about whether or not we can count on our legislature to take this work seriously. Up until this point, there really has been no indication that they plan to greenlight this type of work. And I do respect and honor the folks at the legislature who are working towards this, but ultimately we've been successful here at the city of Boise and also in protecting our legislation. I think we should continue to do what our charge is as electeds to the city of Boise. At this point, I think folks know my commitment to this issue. I have not heard from that organization.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Some years ago, when we passed, two pieces of legislation that, in my memory, one was the smoking in bars. One was the non-discrimination ordinance that now Mayor, then Council Member McLean and Council Member Jordan brought forward. Both of those followed failed attempts in the legislature to pass that ordinance, and frankly were followed those by saying, we'll watch, and if the legislature really doesn't have the appetite to bring this up now that it's been daylighted, now that people know it's an issue, we are not afraid to act. But we gave the legislature the chance to before we passed those ordinances. Wonder if you have an appetite to do that with this.
Madam Mayor, Council President Clegg, I think it's important that we follow our charge as members of the Boise City Council and our commitment to the people of Boise. Again, I refer back to our rental application fee ordinance, which has been in existence since 2019. No other municipality has decided to replicate that. We have not had a legislature that has approved a statewide commitment to regulating rental application fees. I think we need to move forward with our own legislation. And there's nothing stopping folks at the Idaho legislature from moving forward with their own.
Thank you. I appreciate that point of view. I guess I will agree to disagree at this point, at least in my mind. The last question I have, the state has other tools to enforce these kinds of financial issues than cities. Municipalities really only have police power. So the only remedy for enforcement really is issuing citations and fines. Whereas the state, if the state were to choose to do it, frankly, would have maybe easier, more replicable ways to enforce this. Wonder, since you haven't found another municipality in other places, even outside the state of Idaho, who've done it, are you confident that given our experience, frankly, with the rental application fee ordinance, that we actually can enforce it in a way that will be meaningful?
Madam Mayor, Council President Clegg, ultimately, I think it is our commitment as a municipality, when we do pass an ordinance like this, that is our call, is to make sure that we enforce it. I was hoping to see more promotion of our rental application fee ordinance, more education to the community. If this ordinance were to pass, that is something I would be more mindful of, that we need to educate folks. Because ultimately, I think that's what we want. We don't want folks to have to lean on the law. We want folks to be aware of the law so that they don't violate it to begin with. It's hard, even if you've got a law in place. It is very stressful to call upon the law to advocate for your rights. So that's the way I would look at it, is ultimately we want folks to abide by the law so that we don't have to have folks lean on it. And that's something I think that we can certainly do better than we did with the rental application fee ordinance.
One final question, if I might. Have you met with any management companies or rental owners? I know when I brought forward the no smoking ordinance, I met with numerous owners of bars and restaurants who would be impacted by it before we brought it forward. Wondered if you've done that.
Madam Mayor, Council President Clegg, I would be open to that. In years past, again, with the rental application fee ordinance, those conversations weren't always fruitful, but I do know that we did get some emails from some smaller landlords and would absolutely be open to chatting with folks more. But as we know, here in the city of Boise, it's not just small landlords. We actually have big corporations that have overtaken apartment complexes, and it's a whole different animal.
I understand that there are management companies that would be part of that conversation, but appreciate that. Thanks.
Madam Mayor, I know we're way over time. I just have one more comment that I wanted to put out there. Before I was elected to city council approved a 3-foot to pass law for bicyclists that were riding on the road. State wouldn't do it. We'd had some people who were killed riding bicycles here. Since then, it hasn't been enforced. I don't think a single time. I don't think that there's one single ticket that's ever been issued for 3 feet to pass. But we still value it as a cycling community because we know it's the right thing to do. We know that it's a law that should be in place. And the enforcement mechanism for it is difficult. I think it's not as difficult as it should be, but it's still difficult. I kind of look at this as a very similar way. This, to me, I think is the right thing to do. I don't think it's okay that we've got percentages that are all over the place, fees that are taking advantage of people. I would love to see the state, do this for us and have a better mechanism that would allow us to enforce it and also stick up the rights for renters across the state. And at the same time, if the state isn't going to do it, even though our enforcement mechanisms may not be strong, I still think it's something from an educational point and something that we can put out there that creates a template for other people to follow. So I would love to see something like this happen from the state. And I would also like to see something happen from the city if we're not able to get there.
All right. I imagine there'll be further conversation. We're at time. I don't know if anybody has closing comments. Council member.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. No, I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the suggestions by Councilmember Bajent. Those are very helpful. And just ultimately, what I'm looking to is to see, how has that legislation that we passed back in 2019, how has that provided a template for other municipalities? I think it's there. For whatever reason, it has not been replicated. I don't know if it's unique to our city, but it's a reminder to myself that that's ultimately my commitment. My commitment is to the folks who live in the city of Boise. And in the city of Boise, this is very much needed. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We have, speaking of legislation, we have Kathy Griesmeyer with us today to discuss the upcoming legislative session. Welcome, Kathy.
Hi, good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name is Kathy Griesmeyer. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the City of Boise, and I'm here today to offer you a preview of the 2023 legislative session that will be commencing here in just a few short weeks. As a part of my presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of what we're expecting from a state perspective, but also while I had the opportunity to present in front of you today, wanted to offer a little bit of an update as well on some of the federal legislation that we're tracking here at the city as well. And as a reminder, as the Government Affairs Director, I oversee our state and federal legislative work, but also have the distinct pleasure of being able to work with two contract lobbyists, Elizabeth Kreiner and Liz Hatter from Veritas Advisors, who provide support throughout the year for our state legislative work, as well as a federal lobbyist over in DC. Her name's Vicki Cram, who helps support our federal legislative work as well. All right, so commencing, we have the kickoff for the 2023 legislative session will begin on January 9th. So the first full week in January. It will be an especially interesting session given the tremendous amount of turnover we saw during this last election cycle. As a reminder, we had redistricting that took place in 2021, which approved new legislative districts for the 2022 statewide races. and saw a tremendous amount of turnover. Almost 50% of the legislature will be new faces, whether they are folks moving from the House into Senate seats or entirely new lawmakers coming into the state legislature. We also had state elected races as well. So in addition to a number of new lawmakers, we'll be seeing a new lieutenant governor. So former Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeehan will be replaced by the incoming Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke, who's a former Speaker of the House. We have a new Attorney General coming in with the election of Raul Labrador, as well as a new Superintendent of Public Instruction, Debbie Critchfield, and then significant changeover, at least in the House, in terms of leadership. So our new House Speaker is Mike Moyle from Star, and then you have Majority Leader Megan Blanksma from Elmore County and Mountain Home. Then you have, pardon my notes, Representative Dixon from North Idaho, serving as Assistant Majority Leader, and then Representative Dustin Manwaring from Pocatello as Caucus Chair. And then no changeover in Senate leadership teams for this next year. So we have Pro Tem Chuck Winder from the Boise area, continuing to serve, Senator Kelly Anthon from the Burley-Oakley area serving as Majority Leader. Then you have Senator Abby Lee from the Payette area as Assistant Majority Leader, and then Representative Mark Harris from Eastern Idaho serving as Caucus Chair there. And then just last week, the legislature met for their organizational session and kickoff. In addition to their new leadership races and elections, they also appointed new committee chairs, which there was significant turnover in a number of those committees. So we'll be looking forward to building relationships with a number of new committee chairs that oversee issues of importance to the city, such as local government, revenue and taxation, the appropriations committees, transportation, so on and so forth. And I should mention, as I'm going through, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to interrupt. So some key bills to track for next session. One of the largest priorities for the city has been and will continue to be our work on housing preservation, both for affordable housing as well as expanding access to affordable housing. And so the way that I really think about this is in a number of different ways. So first and foremost, continuing to track the historic investments that the legislature made just this past year in the Workforce Housing Trust Fund, where they appropriated $50 million in the state's ARPA money into workforce housing. I think at this point, the last I had heard, there's about 30 million that's been tentatively, I don't know if approved is the right word, but considered in terms of affordable housing projects, where that workforce housing money will serve as gap financing for projects across the state. So we'll continue to monitor if there are any efforts to allocate additional funds into that program, or if the state decides to invest in other programs that expand access to affordable housing development. Certainly something that we continue to talk to lawmakers about is the creation of tax incentives at the state level that, again, can help financially incentivize affordable housing developers to play in our state. Idaho is one of the few states that doesn't have additional state tax incentives that can be paired with federal tax incentives, such as the low-income housing tax credit that's provided at the federal level. And so looking to see ways that the state can, again, continue to attract and incentivize more folks to come in and expand access to affordable housing. And then certainly in the preservation space, looking at tenant protections. So again, we worked the last 2 years to defend and protect our rental application fee ordinance. I'm aware of additional tenant protections that might be moving from other housing coalition organizations that we'd like to be helpful and support as well. And then, of course, the state, through the Idaho Housing and Finance Association, has some additional funds potentially available for appropriation into the state's ERAP program. We were successful in working with them last year to create legislation that would allow for an easier sharing of state dollars that might be returned to Treasury if they were unspent, to stay within the state and to come to our city and county joint program with the Boise City Ada County Housing Authority. And so we'd look to see that additional funds would be appropriated there in the hopes that they might be able to be utilized here if they were at risk of being returned to Treasury.
Madam Mayor. Kathy, is there any specific legislation being proposed on the tax incentives? gosh, 6, 7 years ago, there was some state level incentive language that was brought forward, and maybe that could be revived if there isn't any.
Madam Mayor and Council President Clegg, I have heard some conversations just loosely, but I have not seen any legislation. Certainly, if there were to be a viable option that were to move forward, the city would be very interested in reviewing and potentially supporting, given that it's one of the issues we continue to talk to lawmakers about these last few years.
I'll see if I can dig up my copy of the old one.
That would be great. Thank you. Great. And then another big portion of our work is spent in the municipal budget space. So really at this point, preserving the city's access to revenue that comes in so that we can respond to growth, city resident needs, programs and services that the city provides. And so there's continuing conversations from the Association of Idaho Cities and a number of other local governments that are continuing to talk about potential changes to House Bill 389, which was the sweeping property tax reform bill that was enacted during the 2021 session. Folks are particularly interested in potentially reversing the budget caps that were put in place under that legislation. So as a refresher, there was a 90% cap put on new construction, an 80% cap put on urban renewal development districts, and then an 8% overall budget cap on municipal budgets. I have not seen specific legislation, but certainly it's a talking point that local governments are using with elected officials to talk about budget constraints generally at the local government level, the need to respond to growth given just how much all of our communities are continuing to expand and the cost on services locally. As a city overall, we continue to advocate for a number of property tax reforms. So continuing to see the homeowners exemption reindexed under House Bill 389, the homeowners exemption was raised from $100,000 to $125,000. But if there were an opportunity to reindex that so that it's matched with rising home costs, we'd like to see that move forward. Would certainly like to see the circuit breaker program continue to be expanded so that more residents are able to access the program and or to receive additional funds through that program, as well as the authorization of development impact fees for schools. And that seems to be a general request across the board from at least cities here in the Treasure Valley. And then certainly we're tracking some conversations at the state level around the sales tax distribution formula. There was a public letter shared from a state lawmaker questioning the city's engagement on some of our city sponsorships for local events and potentially using our share of the sales tax distribution formula as a stick to potentially, I'll use correct very loosely, our position on some of those community sponsorship events. And so we'll be tracking very closely how our budget might be implicated based on how the city decides to invest in community events here. I'll pause in case there are any questions.
Kathy, while that last bullet point is very disappointing to me and I can read between the lines, my question is actually on the prior slide. So can you pop back one? We just had a conversation about tenant protections being proposed by one of our council members. Can you give us a brief rundown of the kind of tenant protections that are also being proposed at the state level?
Madam Mayor and Council Pro Tem Whittings, yes, I know that there is legislation being discussed that would enact statewide protections around restrictions on late fees that can be imposed for renters. I have also heard some conversations around, I guess this might be getting to Council President Clegg's question earlier, and apologies if I'm just connecting the dots live as I'm answering this question. But I've also heard of some legislation that would provide some property tax exemptions for affordable housing developers or nonprofit housing developers, either on an ongoing basis or while they're constructing. Those are the sort of biggest ones I've seen at this point. And certainly I imagine there will be more finalized as we start session, but those are the two biggest that I've heard at this point. Okay, transportation is another one that the city will be engaging in throughout the session. And so thanks to the mayor and to Council President Clegg, we've been working for a number of months with the Federal Rail Administration on a new grant program that has been authorized through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act at the federal level, or the infrastructure bill, that would allow for cities to explore the possibility of restoring passenger rail service between two endpoints. We've been working throughout the summer and fall in partnership with a number of partners here at the state, but also over in Salt Lake City with the City of Salt Lake, with support of Mayor Mendenhall there, as well as the Utah Transit Authority, to explore the possible return of passenger rail service between the Boise metro area and Salt Lake City. This program will have a grant notice that should be coming any day now, that will be looking to potentially submit an application, but throughout the summer, we worked to build a fairly large list of supporters who are interested in exploring next steps in this. At this point, the grant right now is meant to really provide federal funds upwards of $500,000 that would come from U.S. Department of Transportation to states and localities who are looking to explore what the possible cost benefit analysis is of returning passenger rail service on a short distance route. And so we are hoping to continue conversations with lawmakers about what that program might look like. We have support from the governor who signed. We submitted an expression of interest to the Federal Rail Administration, I want to say in September, just loosely informing them of our interest and the number of other organizations in the state who are also interested in exploring this option. So we have support from the governor's office, from Senators Risch and Crapo and Congressman Mike Simpson, from a number of mayors along the corridor route, ranging from Caldwell over to the Teton Valley, from Boise State to Idaho State University, to planning organizations and to chambers and a number of other organizations. So fairly robust support from a number of different stakeholders. And we'll be working to educate and communicate to lawmakers what this program looks like, what those next steps are, and how the state can help signal support to FRA that this is something worth exploring. The $1 million question is really how much money this will potentially cost if we were to be accepted into the program as a next step. Those $500,000 in planning and study money would really help us better identify what those costs would look like, so that we could continue conversations with the state and others about funding many years down the road.
Madam Mayor, Kathy, back on that, there's also a long distance study that has been authorized by FRA. The contractor's been chosen. It's ACOM, and Jacobs locally is charged with doing public outreach. So stay tuned for that as well.
Madam Mayor and Council President Clegg, thank you for speaking to the long distance effort as well, which will hopefully support some of the short distance routes as well, given that FRA will be studying the possibility of long distance service between Portland and Salt Lake City on the historic Pioneer Line as well. On a slightly more unfortunate note, we certainly expect for legislation to return this next year that would potentially impose some censorship restrictions on library materials and or impacts to staff and librarians at our libraries. So as a reminder, last year, House Bill 666, while the conversation around the legislation was intended to focus around what type of materials that children or young adults are able to access at our public libraries or school libraries or university libraries, the legislation removed a long-standing affirmative defense in the criminal section of state code that protects librarians and library staff from being prosecuted for potential dissemination of harmful materials. So really a bit of a disconnect between what the conversation around the legislation was and really what the actual legislation was intending to do in imposing those criminal penalties. I do know that the Idaho Family Policy Alliance is planning on returning legislation, whether or not in what form it looks like. I haven't seen their legislation at this point, but the bullet points listed on the slide above are sort of a sampling of options we've heard about that might come back. So whether that be criminal penalties focused, if it impacts the material selection process, outright book bans of particular materials, and or potentially changes to the trustee selection process, which those are the individuals, at least here at the city of Boise, who have oversight of the city's library material selection process. So something that we intend to work on again this next year. And then additionally, broadband as well. There is a state legislative group called the Idaho Broadband Advisory Board, which is comprised of state lawmakers and as well some broadband providers across the state. They had a meeting just recently, a few weeks ago, where they are requesting local governments and cities across the state to submit project requests to them so that they have an understanding of ongoing broadband infrastructure needs across the state as they're intending to appropriate funds, both federal funds as well as state funds around broadband. We have had great success organizing between Ada County and the city, as well as the other Ada County cities, to submit jointly a middle mile grant to the federal government under NTIA, looking to do some middle mile infrastructure investments, sort of like a ring around the county to help increase access to broadband infrastructure. And so we've submitted that grant proposal as well to the state to offer some insight into what the local needs are here, and if an opportunity presents itself to also allow for some funding to come to our locality to help implement that project as well. And then a handful of miscellaneous items that are on the docket. And of course, this is not meant to be a fully inclusive list. I'm sure there will be other issues that will pop up as we go throughout the legislative session, but there has been ongoing scrutiny at the administrative level regarding the Idaho Building Code Board's energy efficiency building codes. There was significant effort just this past fall to delete a large portion of the energy efficiency codes that really lines out the efficiency measurements that local building officials can track for energy efficiency standards and buildings, both for residential and commercial. There was significant pushback from local governments, conservation groups, predominantly the utility organizations, so Vista, Idaho Power, and others, as well as Idaho Building Code officials, who raised significant concerns about what was being proposed and the impact and void it would have around energy efficiency standards in the state. Ultimately, the board decided to pause those rule changes for this upcoming legislative session, and instead will work to convene stakeholders for more thorough conversations throughout 2023, and then interest of potentially bringing something back to the legislature in 2024, using the governor's zero-based regulation standard as a sort of starting point for those conversations. And then I'm also hearing some potential impacts to the city, potentially on our sales tax revenue or in other measures in response to the resolution that the Boise City Council adopted this past summer around abortion enforcement and BPD priorities around investigating doctors and people who are seeking abortion care access in our community. So a handful of things that we'll continue to track as the legislature progresses. That was my last slide on state legislative issues before I get into federal work. So I'll pause in case there are any remaining questions.
Madam Mayor. Kathy, thank you for the update. I have a question on the building and energy codes. Is a negotiated rulemaking approach possible there, or is that what they're attempting to do by other stakeholders? I'm wondering how formal it is in terms of negotiated rulemaking.
Madam Mayor and Councilmember Willits, yes, the Building Code Board did go through negotiated rulemaking this fall, and there were a number of meetings that they held. I think the difficulty in moving those proposed rules forward was really being able to understand how the proposed deletions would actually impact the buildings moving forward, and the very technical sort of interrelated components of energy efficiency standards for HVAC units versus ducts versus piping insulation versus hot water heating, and really being able to bring those particular building experts into the room to talk about how they work to impact the full building envelope. And so I suspect as they move forward next year, they'll really work to bring those building contractors in who specialize in piping, insulation, water, whatnot, to have more of those robust conversations. I think that was the feedback the Building Code Board was really seeking, didn't quite get. There was an attempt to try and demonstrate where certain building energy efficiency regulations might be captured in other components of the building codes that wasn't quite clear or transparent for stakeholders. And so there was just a lot of unknowns about the impact. So I think they'll try and address those on a more detailed and nuanced level moving forward. Hopefully that explanation was helpful. I've learned a lot about building codes in the last few weeks.
Madam Mayor, Real quickly, we're almost out of time, so I'll be very quick. There may also be an attempt to preempt cities' ability to regulate trees in protection of signs. So as that comes forward, we'll be sure and bring something, information.
Yes. And then I'll quickly zip through my federal legislative updates. Significant changeover at the federal level as well, and we're still kind of waiting for the finalized outcome of federal elections. But to jump into the sort of substance, to give you a summary of how the city's been engaging in some of these major federal legislative efforts. As you know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed last year, and there have been a number of grant programs rolling out from a number of federal agencies. What I've compiled on the PowerPoint slide in front of you are a number of the grants either the city has submitted itself, has worked to support and sponsor with partner agencies, or is looking at exploring in future funding cycles. A majority of these programs are funded on a 5-year basis. So these are really what the city has focused its efforts on in year 1. And we'll be doing some planning as we move into next year to look at opportunities for advancing city projects and priorities with this next round of funding cycles. So we have several items on there related to transportation, one from the Department of Energy for our geothermal system, certainly rail, middle mile, and broadband infrastructure. And then more programs are continuing to roll out as the administration and agencies continue to finalize program rules, appropriate funding, collect feedback from partner organizations about how to structure these grants, and then the actual application process. And then additionally, you have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is somewhat of a companion legislation to the infrastructure bill. That's more of the soft infrastructure around climate, healthcare, families and taxes and things of that nature. Much like the infrastructure bill, a number of these agencies are continuing to sort of review what's in the actual congressional text and work to identify what do the programs look like, has funding been approved but not appropriated, and so working to finalize those details. So we'll continue to work with our federal lobbyists as these programs come online and funding opportunities become available. We can connect them with the relevant city departments to move forward on some of these grants. One piece of information I'll share is we did just get the funding amount for the environmental and climate justice block grants, and the city is expected to get just a little over $260,000. We have to submit a project from a compliance standpoint, but some of these programs are beginning to roll out. And then lastly, the Chips and Sciences Act, which is a significant component to how Micron is continuing to expand here in the Boise area. And so we'll continue to connect with a number of federal agencies, Department of Commerce, to talk about some of the workforce and R&D components that are included in both the Chips and Sciences Acts that authorizes some additional funding there, both in terms from the National Science Foundation for workforce development, the National Semiconductor Technology Center to support the new R&D facility. And so again, this is another piece of federal legislation that has a number of moving pieces that are continuing to be finalized, but we'll continue to track and advocate on behalf and in partnership for Micron. And that was everything I had.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Have a good night.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
I move we go into executive session, personnel, land acquisition, records exempt from public disclosure, pending probable litigation, communicate with risk management regarding pending probable claims, labor contract, Idaho Code 742061B, C, D, F, I, and J.
Second.
We have a motion, a second. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Whittings.
Yes.
Bajent.
Yes.
Clegg.
No. I said,
Halliburton.
yes.
Yes.
Sanchez.
Yes.
Willetts.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Thank you. We'll be back here at 6.